Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be talking about the fall and the family. Genesis chapter 6, beginning in verse 1. Now it came about when men began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves, whomever they chose. Now, the big question you're going to ask in this passage is the identity of this phrase, the sons of God. To whom does that refer? We'll get to that in a moment, but I want to first get the context. So we continue in verse 3. Then the Lord said, My spirit shall not strive with man forever, because he also is flesh. Nevertheless, his days shall be 120 years. Now, this section we can take in one of two ways. Either God is saying, from now on, mankind, if you look at the genealogies, the begats that had been given, especially in chapter 5, you had seen people living a long periods of time, to an average of around 900 years or more. And now this is seen to be, instead of 900 years, this is going to be 120 years. And that, I suppose that's a possible interpretation. The problem with that is that even after Genesis chapter 6, when we get to chapters 10 and 11, we're going to see people that are still living longer than 120 years. The average lifespan will go down, and it will go down significantly, but it will not go down immediately to that low of a period. In fact, Moses himself, we're told, he has 40 years in Egypt, and then 40 years being a shepherd, and then 40 years leading the Israelites in the wilderness. And we do the math, and that makes about 120 years. So I'm not sure if that works. Now, another possibility is that God is saying 120 years from now, the flood is going to come, and we're going to read about that in a few verses. That has not yet been introduced. So either one of those two, I think either one works. Verse 4, the Nephilim were on the earth. And you say, well, wait a minute, what about the sons of God? I said, we'll get to those. But first of all, we have this phrase, the Nephilim. Now, the New American Standard translates it this way. What they did is the translators looked at the Hebrew word, and the Hebrew word is the Nephilim, and they said, what does that mean? To what does that refer? The old King James Version translated it, there were giants in the land in those days. And they're probably getting that not so much from the Hebrew, but from the Greek Septuagint, which they felt sort of informed their understanding of the Hebrew. And the Greek Septuagint translated it as giantas, or we would say giants, big people. Does this word mean that? It's not used that many times in the Old Testament. And technically, Nephal, the eem part is always plural. When you say Nephal, that is literally means the fallen one. And so you put an eem on the end, Nephilim, and now it's plural, the fallen ones, plural. Now, what does that mean, that they were fallen ones? Well, let's look at the passage. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. Those were, now it doesn't say those were the Nephilim, it says those were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown, men of, literally, men of a name. But the idea is that they've made a name for themselves, in other words, renown. So it's a good translation. Now, what does it mean? Again, this reference to the sons of God. Nephilim, it's a little, we're not entirely sure. These fallen ones, who were these fallen ones that were on the earth in those days? If you go to the book of Enoch, and you say, what on earth is the book of Enoch? That's not one of the books in my Bible. No, it's not. It's a series of post-Christian writings. When I say post-Christian, that's actually not correct. Post-Old Testament writings, the book of Enoch is actually 7 books that have been compiled, and 7 books about sort of a commentary, and in some ways, I think perhaps some fanciful stories that take place, commenting on this particular passage. And according to the book of Enoch, these Nephilim and these sons of God were angels. They were fallen angels and sort of light creatures. And they made up all sorts of stories, and some of them are quite wild. There's a reason why it's not accepted by Christians or Jews as part of their canon of Scripture, because frankly, they're just sort of wild stories that some Jewish writers, they collected these stories and they put them together eventually, a long time later, into a single volume, in sort of a book, and we refer to those 7 books. We refer to those as the Book of Enoch. All right, we'll talk about that in a minute. The question is, who are these sons of God? And there are several possibilities, actually 3, 2 very common suggested interpretations, and 1 maybe not so common. I want to share all 3 of them. First interpretation, and I'm not, just because it's first doesn't mean I necessarily agree with it, but I think it deserves to be first because this was the traditional Jewish interpretation. That doesn't make it right, but it certainly makes it one of the possibilities, is that these sons of God referred to angels, and specifically it referred to certain fallen angels who did not stick with where they were, but instead came to earth and took wives of human beings. And so you had angels sort of mating with human women, and the result were either these Nephilim, or depending how you translate it, these big people, or these men of renown. Think about all of the stories in Greek mythology, and it's not confined to Greek mythology. You can find the same sort of thing in other cultures too. But I think most people have probably heard of the Greek mythological characters, like Zeus would come down and he would have his way with a human female, and she would give birth, and the one to whom she gave birth might be Hercules, or some other person that was sort of half god and half man. And Josephus, the first century historian, the one who, he writes about John the Baptist, and he writes about Jesus, although that writing is disputed by some people. And he writes about some other folks that we know of in the New Testament. He lived in the latter part of the first century. And he goes through in his book, Antiquities, which tells the story of the Old Testament, but it doesn't stop at the end. It just keeps going all the way up to his present. And Josephus refers to this passage and says, oh, those were angels. Now, he doesn't say that's one of the suggested interpretations. He just says that's what it means. And so he supports this. You also, when you get to Job chapters 1 and chapter 2, and again in Job 38, 3 times in the book of Job, you see that reference to sons of God. The Hebrew is Bena Elohim. We don't need to know the Hebrew. The sons of God works just fine. And that phrase is used in all 3 times in Job to refer to what looks to be angels, those who were there at the creation. You and I weren't there. People were not there, but angels, I think, probably were. And so sons of God seems to be a reference to angels in the book of Job. Thirdly, angels. Now, it's been argued, wait a second, how can these angels how can they go and take human wives? Because Jesus said that angels in heaven do not marry. But it's argued the counterpart to that, these angels weren't in heaven, so they were not doing what they were supposed to be doing. They were doing something other than that they were supposed to be doing. That's why we refer to them as fallen angels. Fourthly, the resulting offspring is said, at least in this interpretation, is said to have produced giants. And like I said, the King James, the way they translated this passage, sort of pushes that interpretation. And I was remember they're basing it on the Septuagint, so don't blame it on the King James version. If you want to blame it on someone, blame it on the Septuagint. That's the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament. And finally, this is supported in, we already mentioned the apocryphal book of Enoch, but also the book of Enoch is actually quoted in the book of Jude. And Jude, there's only 1 chapter in Jude, so I guess we would say chapter 1, but it's verse 6, makes reference to, or is said to make reference to, these angels who did not keep their first abode. And so that again would fit. If that's all connected, if it's talking about the same thing, that would fit this interpretation. It's got a lot to commend itself. And it might actually be correct, perhaps. A second interpretation is that these sons of God refer to the descendants of Seth, as opposed to the daughters of men that refer to just other people. In other words, descendants of Cain, although there could be other descendants as well of just of other people. And so you have two genealogies, two lines, two types of people. And those two types of people are actually traced earlier in the book of Genesis. In Genesis chapter 4, we have the line of Cain, his descendants. It goes all the way down to the seventh generation, Lamech, and he begins to have sons and daughters, and a number of those are mentioned. And of course, that's just a representative sampling. I'm sure there were other sons and daughters that are not mentioned, but you actually have a genealogy there. And then you turn the page to Genesis chapter 5, and you have the descendants of Seth, again, a representative sampling. It's not every son that Seth ever had, but there's a line that's traced. And so you have these two lines that are seen in contrast. And so when I get to chapter 6, after having come out of that context, it would make sense that it's those two lines that are being described here in the opening verses of chapter 6. It fits the context. And that's a strong point of evidence. Secondly, we read back in the end of chapter 4 that there came a time now when men began to call on the name of the Lord. And so it makes sense for them to be called sons of God because they're calling on the name of the Lord. Again, that seems to fit the context. Thirdly, it's mankind that is punished in the flood. When we're going to read as we go on through Genesis chapter 6 and going into chapter 7 and chapter 8, where God sees the wickedness of mankind. He doesn't say he sees the wickedness of angels. It doesn't say he punishes the angels. It doesn't say he punishes the giants or the men of renown, but he punishes mankind. And so it would seem from that mankind is in view. He is the one being punished in the flood, not angels, not other sorts of creatures. It's mankind that is punished, and therefore mankind that is being described in these phrases, sons of God and daughters of men. Finally, we ought to point out that sonship, and not just physical sonship, but spiritual sonship, is a common theme, not just in the New Testament, which is obviously a common theme there, but in the Old Testament as well. You will remember, for example, Hosea, where God says, when Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. Now, when we get to the New Testament, that passage is going to be used by the New Testament writers to say, see, that's a lot like Jesus. You ought to see Jesus there. But in the context of what Hosea said when he quotes that, when he gives that passage, he's talking about Israel and how Israel, in some sense, was the son of the Lord. In other senses, you could describe Israel as the bride of the Lord, and that works too. But the sonship, that's what I want you to see, is a common theme in the Old Testament. So it shouldn't surprise us to see it here in Genesis 6. Finally, the idea of the marriage of a godly seed to ungodly people is going to be a very regular theme in the book of Genesis, where we're going to get to Abraham. And Abraham and Sarah are going to have a son, Isaac. And when it comes time for Isaac to get a bride, Abraham's not going to say, well, yeah, just go across town. We live here in Canaan and find a bride for yourself. Go out and date a Canaanite. No, he's not going to say that. He's actually going to send his servant back to find a godly seed back in Haran, the place from which Abraham had come. And not only will he do that, but Jacob also will go to Haran. Now, he'll go for other reasons, but while he's back in Haran, he will pick up not one wife, but he'll get two for the price of one. But they are believers in Yahweh instead of marrying Canaanites. In fact, one of the negatives that we're going to read about Esau in the Jacob and Esau story is that Esau will take a Canaanite wife, and that won't be a good thing. So that's a theme that's going to be further developed in the book of Genesis, and it would fit here in this passage as well. Now, a third interpretation that has been suggested, not quite so well known, and these are not necessarily mutually exclusive, because this I think this one would work in conjunction, perhaps, with the previous one that we just looked at. And that is that the sons of God refer to kings and rulers. Are they kings and rulers from the family of Shem? Or are they kings and rulers from the family of Cain? And I don't know, but just kings and rulers. And it's true that the term Elohim, remember this is sons of God, B'nai Elohim is the way you say it in Hebrew. So it's got that word Elohim. Elohim is the word for God. And that same Hebrew word Elohim, although usually most often it refers to the God, and then sometimes it refers to pagan gods, because after all, it is plural. But it can be used in a couple places in Exodus chapter 21:6, in Exodus 22, verses 8 and 9, in Psalm 82, several places there in that psalm. It can refer to human judges, human VIPs, people that have authority, but people instead of just God. Secondly, there are some similar uses in Babylonian texts. Now you say, well, wait a second. Um, the Old Testament isn't written in Chaldean, it's not written in a Babylonian language. No, but that's the culture to which it had come out of. And so, sometimes we look to see the cultural background of the day in the use of terms, in the use of phrases, and in how we understand them. So again, it's legitimate to at least look and ask the question. Kings in the East were often referred to as Elohim, even if they weren't necessarily being worshipped. In Egypt, the Pharaoh was worshipped as a god, but you would go to Mesopotamia, and most oftentimes, human rulers were not worshipped specifically as a god. They might be the spokesperson for God, they might be representing God, but they usually weren't worshipped as divine in most of those cultures. And yet they still might be referred to as Elohim in the fact that they were sort of standing in for God. They were representing him. They were the hand of that God. Remember, they were usually polytheistic, so it was whatever God from whichever city that they represented. The actions here of one acting like a ruler, acting and taking authority, are said to be paralleled in the actions of Lamech. Remember, Lamech is the one who, in Genesis chapter 4, he writes a song. It's a very early song in the scriptures, and about how a young man presumably had attacked him, and he killed him. And so now he says, God said he was going to take vengeance on anyone who messes with Cain. I'm going to do it, 70-fold if anybody messes with me. So don't mess with me, because I'm big, I'm powerful, like a king, like a ruler, and so that action is paralleled in Lamech. Finally, we already noted that the term Nephilim refers to fallen ones, doesn't refer necessarily to giants. I guess a fallen one can be a giant, but the word itself doesn't mean that. And so again, this would work here with this interpretation. Now we continue, and we're not going to continue very, very far, but we want to at least take in verses 5 and 6. Verse 5, then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great on the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And the Lord was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart. So we've seen creation, we've seen family that was set forth, but then the fall came, and here we're seeing the results of the fall carried to its logical consequences. You see, Genesis 1 and 2, we'd seen where God he had ordained marriage, and he had ordained family. And then we saw that begin to break down really in chapter 3, where we have the woman who takes of the tree and eats. She's not waiting for the leadership of her husband. Of course, he takes and eats with her. And then that broken pattern, because I think it was a broken pattern, where in chapter 4 you have Cain who kills Abel, and that's a dysfunctional family by every sense of the word. But it doesn't stop there. It goes through the line of Cain, And then we see the line of Lamech, and we get to Genesis chapter 6, and the sons of God and the daughters of men, and whichever interpretation you choose, whether it's angels, or whether it's the line of Seth and Cain, or whether these are rulers, in any case, the family is being affected by the fall. And now we're going to see in the coming chapters how God moves to save a single family. It will initially be Noah and his family, and he will bring them safely through the flood. But then after this is a preview of coming attractions. After this, we'll eventually see where God again works through a single family, not just to save that single family, but to bring salvation to the whole world. This is Genesis chapter 12, verse 3, where he's going to make Abraham and his family a blessing, and he'll say, through your seed, all the world will be blessed.